Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we're going to discuss not the impending election, but our favorite horror films and fiction. I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari and Geoff Schullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So, Halloween is looming. Great time to kind of curl up with a scary book or watch, a classic piece of horror. What are some of the things that you guys tend to return to around this time of year?
So I think, as I've said on this podcast, after a while, if you record a podcast once a week for nearly 3 years, as we have, Compact is approaching its third year of existence. If you're not a subscriber, go to compactmag.com and join us. And by the way, if you are a subscriber and want to become like a super friend of Compact, we now have a donate page. It would help us a lot to be able to expand our various projects or launch new ones. Compactmag.com/donate. Anyway, sorry for that. So I feel like if you've done a podcast enough for 3 years, once a week, you'll start to repeat yourself. But I don't know if I've put out the theory that I think that the horror genre is just one of the most um, fertile, kind of intellectually fertile, psychologically fertile. It's just a very useful way. It's a very useful lens on the world, a distorted lens to be sure, but somehow able to access truths that may not be accessible in nonfiction or even in kind of non-genre fiction. So I'm a great horror fan. I think some of the best output in contemporary Hollywood is is its horror output. Um, so I mean, I gotta go with the combination of Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick because it's back on HBO Max right now. Um, I remember hearing about The Shining long before I watched the Kubrick movie, um, from my mother, who and her circle of friends who had watched it years earlier and all decided that it's just the scariest thing um ever, including, like, I heard stories about, like, friends not, typically women not being able to go into the bathroom because of the old lady scene, what transpires in room 237 of the Overlook Hotel. And then I watched it and I just I was gripped by it. And this was in my early teens, I want to say 12, 13, something like that. And then I'll tell an embarrassing story, which will haunt me probably. But at age like 28, when I was working for the Wall Street Journal, I was single, and there was a revival of The Shining at the IFC Theater downtown, and I went and saw it, and then I had to like go home to my own apartment alone, and like the long hallway of a New York City apartment building was just a little bit more unnerving than it should have been for a 28-year-old, perfectly think like sane, rational adult. So that's how gripping the Shining can be. And just one more note: there's a documentary, I believe, called Room 237. I don't know if Jeff's seen this, but it's about all the elaborate theories that people have spun about the deeper meaning of The Shining, and why it is, for example, that Stanley Kubrick deliberately created um, this structure for the building that is just illogical. In other words, there are rooms where there shouldn't be a hallway, but there is, or shouldn't be a window, but there is, and so on, and what it all means. And some are like kind of sensible, like the movie being an allegory for um, colonialism, because okay, we hear that the Overlook was built on an Indian burial ground of colonialism and kind of the genocides of indigenous peoples of the Americas. Some of them are just insanely outlandish. But anyway, I'll just that as a starting gambit. And then on the fiction front, or in an adjacent way, about the same age, 12, 13, when I watched The Shining, I also read Misery, which is not a supernatural horror, but it's utterly gripping, Stephen King. I could not put it down. So I'll just throw those two out there.
Yeah, The Shining is phenomenal. And I do recommend the documentary that you mentioned, Room 237, for those who haven't seen it. And yeah, I think similarly to you, Sohrab, I had its reputation preceded it in my mind and in my household as well. In fact, the thing I remember most was the all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy thing, which I remember my parents joking about because they both were writers partly. They were academics and wrote things and would go places and try to undertake writing projects, and they would joke about that the scene where it's discovered that his typewriter is just this bizarre reputation of this, or sorry, repetition of this single sentence over and over again. And it was there were that and a few other things were like brought up as jokes frequently in my household as kind of references to the film. So I sort of had this like weirdly humorous sense of it before I actually saw it. And then yeah, I think I saw it around age 11 or 12 maybe for the first time, and was extremely haunted by it. And then on the other hand, a fun fact about myself is at one point I had a pair of curtains that I got at like a thrift store that were the pattern of the rug from the Overlook Hotel. If people can people can look this up, but that there's the pattern on the carpet is very distinctive, and part of the sort of symbolism and aesthetic of the film. So I had this pair of curtains that I thought would be kind of fun to have and whatever. I was single at the time, and I remember in
And
any
the
case.
curtains were helping you stay that way.
Right, I was going to say at a certain point it became without going into detail. At a certain point, it became clear to me that this wasn't the best way of ending my being single. So I got some other curtains, but they were fun to have for a while. Uh, so yeah, it is. I think it is interesting that it has this. Before there was such a thing, it had this kind of meme ability to it as well, which I think is part of its power. Which again speaks to like how I first encountered it through just these little snippets. I mean, the one that you see most often is the one of the door, of Shelley Duvall at the door with Jack Nicholson, kind of plunging the knife through the door, and this is often reused where various other people are replaced. The faces of Shelley Duvall and Jack Nicholson are replaced with various other people. So I'd say this is maybe the most popular kind of current meme version of it that is circulated the most widely. But it's interesting to me that before the era of memes, it was like there were a few little snippets from it that again I was introduced to before I saw the film, and then perhaps certain things like the carpet pattern are examples of that as well. Just that I think part of its power is it has these potent, just kind of frozen images and moments, and just uh, little bits of the sort of broader aesthetic that just seep out into the culture and sort of have really just become kind of part of the cultural landscape. So
The thing that really stuck with me when I first watched it was just the image of Jack Nicholson frozen at the end, uh, which I thought didn't fit with the tenor and terror of the movie. It was just a moment where my belief in the movie was broken somehow, um, which was disappointing because it was so compelling. Otherwise, I will admit to not being the biggest Kubrick fan, but the Shining, I think, has a real power of its own. There's this sense of mystery and menace in the Overlook Hotel. Uh, it actually reminds me of pretty different movie, Solaris by Andrei Tarkovsky, where there's this kind of mystery and menace in a particular space, where the seeming presence of something supernatural. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. I haven't read the novel, I'll admit, so I can't really draw a comparison there. I'm not the biggest Stephen King head, so I guess I've read Pet Cemetery, pretty good.
Stephen King, another of these sort of cringe lib cultural figures who just, if the internet had never gone where and if social media had never come into existence, like you wouldn't know that he's just this sort of basic bitch libtard, like of the worst sort. It's yeah, very very strange. That there's something kind of uncanny about it. In fact,
Yeah, to be clear, I don't
Yeah,
claim
yeah.
for
Surab's
Misery
all
in
of his
any great.
claims about the horror genres, moral power and conservative insight into society.
It is a right wing genre. I think that's true. I mean, I have this. I was reading this contemporary horror novel, and the introduction to it was like, horror is a right wing genre, and that's terrible. Here, I'm trying to do. I mean, this was a pretty mediocre contemporary horror novel, but like literary horror. I was like, here, what I'm trying to do is flip the right wing script of the genre, which is fine, go for it. But it was just I don't. It was so forgettable. I don't even remember what the title is or who the author is. But none of these like horrors that get celebrated in the New York Times Book Review. But no, I just very quickly I wasn't claiming some great literary merit for Misery. I just think at age 13, it really kept me turning the pages. Is all.
my case for the most underrated contemporary American author is Brian Evanson, who is, I'd say, a writer of sort of literary horror. Although he has written some things in the Tor imprint, which are more pulpy, but much of what he writes is somewhat more. I mean, he teaches in an MFA program. He's published by Coffee House, or it was for a while published by Coffee House Press, which is a literary press in Minneapolis. Mostly publishes kind of high end literary fiction. But I really think he's one of the real masters of horror, kind of in the tradition of H.P. Lovecraft, of Edgar Allan Poe, of various other sort of American masters of the genre, going back to the earliest American literature. I mean, some of Hawthorne as well. So I think he's a really great and again underrated figure. And one thing that's kind of interesting about him is he comes from a Mormon background. He's by upbringing, and I think until his early to mid adulthood, he was a practicing Latter Day Saint. Although at some point he left, or maybe was. I'm not sure if perhaps he was excommunicated. I'm not sure because I know that he wrote a couple of these very disturbing books. The first one is called Altman's Tongue, and just extremely visceral and creepy. And at that time, I believe he was like a bishop in the Mormon church. So there was kind of this weird disconnect where everybody knew him to just be this kind of nice and very compassionate guy who was part of this sort of wholesome, Mormon community. But then he was writing this extremely twisted, violent stuff. And then at some point, some of his novels and novellas kind of turned to Mormon themes. So most notably is one called The Open Curtain, which really deals with and I believe this is the first one he wrote maybe after leaving the church, because he definitely wouldn't have gotten away with it as a member, because it really deals with some of the more kind of disturbing elements of the early history and sort of the ambiguities of the early theology of the church. But it's basically about a young man who's kind of haunted by a strange murder that seems to have been tied to this early doctrine of blood atonement that was, sort of a ritualized killing of apostates that had a certain level of seeming approval within the early church. And so it's kind of a dark and disturbing history, but it's about a young man who kind of, revisits and is sort of drawn into this disturbing history, and then kind of becomes sort of part of it and becomes sort of absorbed into it. And so it's just a very good novel, even leaving aside the sort of historical ties. And and then the other one I really recommend, which deals just with, I suppose, kind of cult, a sort of cult setting, is called Last Days. And it imagines, it's essentially a kind of noir sort of private detective story that imagines a private detective who's essentially investigating this amputation cult of people who, as they reach higher and higher levels within the cult, and kind of move up into the hierarchy, like amputate more and more limbs. And it's anyway, Last Days. It's extremely good, very bizarre, twisted, violent, and kind of funny as well. And then also, I'd recommend his short stories, particularly the collection called Wind Eye. And specifically, the title story, Wind Eye, I believe, is one of the really masterpieces of the horror sort of short story genre of recent decades. So that would be my recommendation. And then, as far as film goes, I've talked about Cronenberg, I think, on this podcast before, so I won't go into Cronenberg himself, but I will mention two films I've seen this season, the past couple of months, that are clearly kind of descended from Cronenberg. One is one much more sort of widely seen than the other. The first is The Substance, with Demi Moore playing a sort of, aging starlet who attempts to revive her youth through this strange practice, or this strange treatment. And and then, essentially kind of generates this youthful doppelganger who in some ways allows her to recover her prior star status, but at a great cost. And it's an interesting film. It has some suggestive images. It's also one of the actually grossest films I've seen for a while. I was kind of impressed with just the sheer physical, the sort of body horror grossness of it. It really is like icky and slightly nauseating. I mean, I actually felt nauseated at certain points, and I'm pretty inured to this stuff I'm seeing in theaters. So it's interesting, but I think it unfortunately has this somewhat tedious sort of ideological overlay where it's just about this rather obvious point about the way that sort of the Hollywood and televisual economy of images kind of chews up and spits out women. And so it has, unfortunately, a kind of bland, somewhat even dated seeming feminist message attached to it, which I think doesn't do it any favors as a film. But it nevertheless, I think, succeeds in certain ways just because of the effectiveness of the basic concept of the way this treatment works, and the relationship between this woman and her doppelganger is sort of imagistically effective, even if ideologically it's rather stale. So I'd say it's kind of a 2 out of 4 stars, or maybe 2.5 out of 4 stars recommendation. And then the one I'd recommend more highly, which is in a different way a kind of Cronenberg descendant, which I think is perhaps also a feminist film, although in a much more subtle and ambiguous way, is called Red Rooms. It's a Canadian film, so like Cronenberg, by a Canadian director, and it's I would say, if people are familiar with Videodrome, it's essentially a kind of replay of that concept of a horrifying video that circulates, in this case, on the internet. And in Videodrome, it's through through the kind of pirate airwaves. And it's basically about this woman's obsession, or several women's obsession, with this man who is accused of having murdered a number of young women on video and then sort of circulated these videos on the dark web. And so it's partly a courtroom drama and partly the story of these two women in particular, obsession with this man. Um, so it kind of deals with like the I suppose the kind of well known phenomenon of like women's strange obsession with serial killers in particular. But also it has a kind of detective element of this woman who's trying to get to the bottom of whether he did it, and also trying to obtain these illicit, extremely horrifying videos on the dark web. So it's in a different way, I think, a kind of, although without the kind of bizarre, it remains in a kind of realist register. So it doesn't have the kind of bizarre reality bending qualities of Videodrome, but it is an interesting kind of descendant of that film. And so, I find those films kind of an interesting pairing as far as the sort of descendants of Cronenberg making movies today, both by women directors, notably. So,
well, we've talked about Cronenberg. I think we had like an episode of this podcast, or at least one topic of an episode of this podcast devoted to my and Geoff's and Matthew's admiration for David Cronenberg. So, I'm keen to see the others you mentioned. I saw a movie that's out, which is, I believe, a remake of a European movie called Speak No Evil. I've been meaning to catch that in a theater, but that struck me as a sort of Michael Haneke descendant. But I I have kids, and I'm always making plans to like go to the theater on my own at 10 o'clock. Once the kids are asleep, and then I fall asleep too. I really want to read. I've long wanted to read Brian Evanson. Unfortunately, I can't react to that because I haven't. But your remarks about a chilling short story put me in mind of someone I've really gotten into. I wish she had written more short stories because I've devoured all the ones that she has, namely Shirley Jackson, the great Gothic horror mid-century American novelist. Her short stories are in the horror genre, or at least they're broadly categorized as horror, and yet few of them have this kind of obvious, certainly kind of obvious supernatural terror, or even a direct element of terror. It's just about, they're often about this sort of just the unsettling quality of modern Midtown Manhattan life, or modern life in general, typically often New York subjects, or kind of rural America, New England, places like that. Just this sort of subtle menace that undergirds modern life. You can't often pinpoint it. Sometimes it has a direct kind of racist or anti-Semitic source, and that's where it comes from. And I think she was writing at the time that she was writing, these forces were much more potently out there in American life. But sometimes it's just taking a bus ride when you're feeling sick and you can't fall asleep, and just like ordinary life takes on this malicious edge. And it's just what the economy with which she does all this. Some of these short stories are as short as like a page and a half, 2 pages, is astonishing. But I need to read Evanson.
Haven't read Evanson myself. Hope to catch up to that someday. And for the last couple of years, around this time of year between now and Christmas, I've been reading some older and the classic writers of ghost stories and supernatural tales. A couple notable names in the ghost story genre are M.R. James and J. Sheridan Le Fanu, the latter of whom is generally credited with inventing the ghost story. Maybe his best is Green Tea, very very famous story about a substance which kind of changes a man and makes him open to certain spiritual realities or presences that are dark and destructive. And it was around the time I was reading Green Tea that a thread on Twitter went viral about all the people who have taken I don't know, some kind of psychedelic substance. I can't remember which drug, and then felt that they all had encountered demons, and sometimes specific same demons, and I thought that is so odd because they're certainly not taking the green tea described by J. Sheridan LeFanu, but whatever the veracity of these reports is, there's some sense that taking a substance in an ill-advised manner can somehow open you to very dark places. Um, yeah, I really recommend LeFanu. Mr. James, I don't have as high an opinion of. His stories, seem to turn on a couple things. One is the vice of curiosity. If you go too far, it can have these dangerous consequences. And then very frequently, the kind of shuddering moments in them have to do with the horror of touch. And it's a wonderful thing to have, to write the scary stories about, because there is almost nothing more unsettling than an unexpected and unwelcomed touch, or the touch of something truly unfamiliar. A kind of cold yet furry and wet and heavy substance somehow unexpectedly hitting you is so repulsive. And with James, I do wonder if this distaste for touch somehow goes deeper. Aside from a few stories, one of my favorite is A Warning to the Curious, about a crown that helps to protect England from invaders. They just leave me a little cold. They're pleasant and they're very artful, but they lack power. And for stories that have a little more power, I think Arthur Machen is wonderful. He's the author, most famously of The Great God Pan, which is a wonderful story that has a kind of you know Robert Louis Stevenson element of the horrors of science, as in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the horrors that science can unearth, but also as in a lot of Machen's work, there is this horror of a kind of pre-Christian pagan past that is somehow coming back and has this dark and alluring power. uh there, it kind of has this music that is strange and compelling, and it leads to madness. There's another wonderful story, The White People. It's really uh, consists of these diary entries from a young girl who, we realize as we keep reading, is being seduced into some kind of ancient witch cult, which will require every sacrifice of her. Um, and I think that's where the good stuff is. More so than James, who writes proper ghost stories. I think Machen, who's a bit more of a horror writer, I think hits harder.
I love the theme of the sort of return of the pagan. um and also you mentioned in the context of, I believe, Mr. James, of uh a psychedelic drug unleashing things for which its users aren't prepared for.
Yeah, that
That's
that one was Lefanu, green
Oh, that
green
was a
tea.
fun. That's right. Okay.
Probably, yeah, his
Yeah.
most highly regarded story. Yeah.
I I say that with fully aware that right now I'm writing a long essay for Compact, which will appear hopefully this Friday. It's about 9,000 words long so far, and it will probably grow, and then Matthew will take the scythe to it. But it's about ayahuasca and how, which is a
For some true
uh,
body horror, look at our editorial
look
process
at
as we cut and maim manuscripts.
Indeed. Though none of us rises up to the level of the Butcher of East 56, Neil Kozlodoy, legendary editor at Commentary. We're all. It's like I think there's a joke where it's like I finally, one of my sentences appeared in Commentary or something like that, because Kozlodoy rewrites everything. But anyway, I'm writing this essay about one psychedelic, namely ayahuasca, which is a traditional form of dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, and my experiences with that in rural Mexico. So look out for that. But yeah, little cults are the return of the pagan, or the return of spiritual adversaries that Christianity was supposed to have vanquished, is a fantastic theme. Of course, we've talked about Ari Aster's horror on this podcast, so we won't go into it, but he's terrifically good on those. I also think of course, the Polanski movie is a classic of Rosemary's Baby, but the novel by Ira Levin is also really good. And
Hmm.
I once got really, I mean, it's a middlebrow kind of novel, right? Just it has some literary pretensions, but it's also aware of itself as a middlebrow novel. But actually writing a really tightly plotted middlebrow horror novel is difficult. Let me tell you. I mean, I'm not saying I set out to do it, but it's just an enormous amount of skill involved in that, and you see that with Ira Levin, because at one point I became curious about his process for writing Rosemary's Baby. I was obviously, having read the novel and just being really into the movie. Then you can find his notebooks. You can find his notebooks that went in as research for the novel. So of course, like the characters, he's written just uh, in an enormous amount of detail that never makes it to the novel. Rosemary is a Catholic, comes from a large family. She's from Iowa or somewhere else in the Midwest. He's written this like novel length background on any of his characters, and only hints are dropped into the actual final product of a novel. Or he's talking about like this building on the Upper West Side that is very desirable but has a dark history, and he's done all this research on apartment buildings of the kind on the Upper West Side. He's mapped out what the apartments in question are like, using sort of pseudo architects draftsmanship to kind of create. So I was so enamored of the degree of work that went into the writing of this 200-page novel. Just multi-volume notebooks of research into every little detail that you can imagine to create that product. Anyway, just rest in peace, Ira Levin. Just like great middlebrow genre writer. Just a master.
And really, remarkable range as well. He wrote The Boys from Brazil, The Stepford Wives, like he's sort of a sort of towering figure in 20th century American culture. People don't really remember, but he really supplied some of the key mythology of, and again, it's sort of a testament to a certain kind of like middlebrow fiction publishing of the late 20th century.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Rosemary's Baby, which is so wonderful. Just wonderfully set and shot, and has this great feeling of specificity of being in a particular place and time that I've really enjoyed that, and that greatly assists with the horror. That's often what you need to convey a sense of the uncanny, or the uh, horrifying, weird, and supernatural. You have to convey an absolute naturalism otherwise, and I think uh, Polanski just does that so well in the film. And it's just a great moment in the horror genre. The kind of the set of pedophobic films, as they're sometimes called. You have Rosemary's Baby, right? You have The Exorcist. You have The Omen, which is also about this horrifying child. And as a father of four young boys, I have, I will admit, from time to time, spoken about my children's exorcist moments where they're just screaming and flailing, and or just children are kind of they throw up, and I didn't realize this when I watched The Exorcist, as a young single man, that to some extent it's just about parenthood and a fairly realistic depiction of what the experience is like. And I'm sorry, this is will sound very unfair to my children. They're actually uh, not bad, and I've certainly have nothing to complain of. Uh, but sometimes you're at your wits' end, and the one of the kind of things about The Exorcist, and its uh, religious meaning is that there are these priests and others who love this child who is absolutely demonic, and so it's about the difficulty and burden of loving people and the demands of charity, and how a lack uh, of of charity can uh, leave you thinking that the child just isn't worth this intervention. Here, I should uh, cite an essay that my former colleague, Julia Yost, wrote at First Things, called Fear of Children. It's a discussion of The Exorcist, the film, and the novel. She she gets at that particular element of that film, but it's I think you see it in Rosemary's Baby, which doesn't have the same kind of Catholic meaning and framework. I think it's a different. It's trying to do something a little different than William Peter Blatty was up to in the story he wrote that became the Exorcist film. Uh, and then The Omen, so fun. I think is the line from the film. His mother was a jackal. Some kind of old Irish priest saying that. I just always think of that line, and it's so campy, but I mean it's really pretty good.
What you hinted at about the sort of pedophobia and the horror just of parenthood, which every parent, no matter how much you love your children, go through those exorcist-like moments with kids who are not possessed. Just regular old kids will just act like Miss Blair. You know, gets us to another point, which maybe I'll call an audible and see if you guys can give me good examples of this. But I think the best horror works at the level of there's some mundane tension that is already there, in the before the transmundane comes along and is disrupts the picture. Already there is marital problems, it may be hinted at in Rosemary's, or the fact that he neglects her for her career and so on. Or already there's one good example of this, which I think is actually a really, really good horror movie, is Descent, which is a movie about a group of women who, one of them has